All right, once again, welcome to our State and Federal Programs Directors Meeting, our first meeting for this year. And this is Bonnie McFarland. I'd like to welcome you along with our team, Evan Bartelheim, Adrian Balcazar, Amy Tomomatsu, Rachel Garcia, and Jeannie Key. And you'll be hearing from all of them today. I feel like we've kind of been with some of you all summer. We had a summer professional development series, but this is the first of our regular meetings. And because the continuity plan and issues surrounding that have been such a timely issue right now and people have questions, we're going to provide an update on that. And we invited our folks who work with the LCAP and related programs and who are working with that plan to join us today. So welcome to all of you. We will be having a second meeting in September on the 24th. So we'll be dealing, I know there are a lot of issues that are sort of burning issues for some of you right now. We'll hit as many of them as we can, but we'll be following up on some of them at our next meeting, which will just be in 2 weeks. So let's take a look at today what we're hoping to address. The following areas. We're going to look first at some questions we've received and provide some recent information relative to the Learning Continuity and Attendance Plan. We're going to look at the Learning Loss Mitigation Fund, the use of those funds, and also some review of some recent legislation. We're going to talk about fiscal accountability as it applies to the CARES Act funds and what requirements apply. We'll also be addressing questions we've gotten regarding equitable services and the CARES Act funds and some of the questions surrounding that. And then finally, an update on some school plan requirements and particularly also focusing on comprehensive support and improvement for this year and moving forward. So those are the topics that we'll be looking at today. To answer your questions, as you can see, a lot of these are issues that are fast-moving issues that we're trying to get answers on for you. So please put questions in the chat. We appreciate your questions. They're usually right on and drive us to seek answers from the department as needed. We will continue what we've been doing from last year, and that was to follow up with a Q&A subsequent to our meetings, so you can have the responses in writing. So now I'm going to turn it over to Evan, who's going to start with an overview of the Learning Continuity Plan. Evan?
Thanks, Bonnie. Good morning, everyone. And before we get into the nuts and bolts or the what of the plan, we feel that it's important to briefly frame the why of the plan. And the why includes not only an explanation of the plan's purpose as laid out in the legislation, but also a discussion of some related accountability and expectations around the plan that may help you refine your understanding of the plan's role. Next slide, please. So to start, let's discuss just the fundamental and practical purpose of the plan, the purpose that probably matters most to your stakeholders, your staff, your community, your parents. This plan is really an opportunity to demonstrate that you learned from the COVID crisis as it unfolded in the spring, that you listened to what your students, your parents, teachers, and experts had to say about what could be done to ensure that you limited the impact on student learning loss of COVID, and that you have a plan to respond to all of your student needs. State School Board President Linda Darling-Hammond recently acknowledged in a CASBO podcast that this plan is, quote, a big order coming in the midst of the reopening of schools. She acknowledged that it's going to be hard and the timing is really not great. But she emphasized that it's needed to assure your community members that student learning, and particularly the needs of the students with the greatest needs, that learning has continuity regardless of the method of delivery, as we'll probably be in and out of schools or could potentially be in and out of schools throughout the fall or throughout the year. And ultimately, what parents, and I'm a parent of 2 middle schoolers, I think want to know is that the districts and charter schools have a plan that addresses their children's specific needs. At the end of the day, we just want to know, okay, you got my back. So I think that that's really the kind of a fundamental cause, and maybe should encourage you to guide the way you communicate this plan. But there are some other requirements or some of the why that we'll now discuss. Next slide, please. So a more technical why for the plan was laid out by the CDE in explaining how the template was developed in response to SB 98. First, the plan describes what the LEA plans to do to address COVID-19, including the actions taken to ensure the safety and health of students and employees. Second, it describes the expenditures being made to implement the plan, specifying the inclusion of the learning loss mitigation funds and any other state and federal funds that are needed to address student needs. Third, it balances the needs of all stakeholders, including educators, parents, students, and community members, and acknowledges the diversity of concerns expressed both within and between these diverse groups. Fourth, it supports meaningful stakeholder engagement by explicitly identifying required groups and meetings that need to be held, including efforts to engage parents whose access might be limited to the plan, either through lack of internet access or language barriers. Fifth, it condenses several pre-existing plans, such as any LEA reopening plans that might have been in the works, or the mandatory COVID-19 containment response and control plan that the LA County Health Department required of all LEAs. Sixth, it memorializes all the planning that's already been undertaken by LEAs for the 2021 school year. Planning that addresses gaps in learning, the meaningful stakeholder engagement that's been ongoing, the transparency that's required of all plans, the needs of our unduplicated pupils, the needs of our students with unique needs, and students experience homelessness. It provides access to devices and connectivity for distance learning, and any other resources and supports to address student and staff mental health and social emotional well-being. Those are all going to be memorialized in this one place. And finally, it formalizes the plan. I know there are a lot of plans on every district website you go to will have a multitude of plans. This is a formal plan that puts everything in one place, that notes a plan for in the midst of the uncertainty caused by this pandemic. Next slide, please. As noted on the previous slide, there is an expectation to identify funds that are being used to implement every aspect of the learning continuity plan. And this does present a significantly different challenge than any of the other plans that LEAs are asked to consolidate within the learning continuity plan. It's a frequent question that we're receiving. What funding sources are we supposed to include here, and how much of each one of these? So the table on this slide reflects a number of the sources that we've seen reflected in some of the plans that we've seen so far. And I want to be clear, this is not a list of funds that must be included. Rather, given that these funds may be used to fund actions specific to the requirements of the learning continuity plan, they may make sense, and hopefully this will be a jumping off point. You may think, oh yeah, we do have some actions that we're utilizing, or that we're using the federal funds for. So just wanted to note it. But just among the sources, your ESSER funds, in many instances, these would have been expended in the spring. You may not put these in your action table necessarily, but you may put these in your descriptions of what you've done so far. If you purchase technology using ESSER funds or cleaning supplies, you may want to reflect that, because this is a comprehensive plan as far as your response to COVID. Your learning loss mitigation funds, including your GEAR coronavirus relief funds and the general fund that's within that, we'll talk at great length later about that, but these should be definitely included to the extent that they are designed to meet the needs of learning loss mitigation throughout this pandemic. They should be included in here. Your LCFF money, specifically any of your supplemental concentration funds that are being used for actions, should be reflected here. But then you may have additionally some federal nutrition services funding, ACES funding may be used, any federal ESSA funds that may fall within the allowable program activities, such as maybe Title IV, and identifying additional technology needs. The low performing students block grant came up as one option to be used, and then any other relevant local funds. So just a jumping off point for what you might include here. Next slide, please. Another development with regards to expectations around this plan that we wanted to make you aware of, it comes in the form of a joint letter from the public advocates and the ACLU that was sent to all superintendents in the state. This letter is titled Guidance to Public School Districts About Legal Requirements During the 2021 School Year, and states that although federal and state policymakers have modified certain legal requirements, such as the expectation of completing an LCAP, most legal and regulatory requirements remain in place to ensure California students continue to receive their fundamental rights through education during this time. And it goes on to state that the schools are obligated to provide high quality, accessible, free, distance, and hybrid learning, provide critical mental health and social emotional resources. Districts and LEAs are expected to continue to use LCFF supplemental and concentration funds to increase and improve services for our high need students, to implement meaningful community engagement practices when developing the learning continuity and attendance plan, and track student attendance, participation, and progress. Also note that at the end of the letter, if you can get a copy from your superintendent if you haven't already seen it, there's an appendix that outlines some best practices relevant to both the development of the learning continuity plan as well as for the implementation of remote learning, mental health and well-being, the use of supplemental and concentration funds, stakeholder engagement, and transparency, and it's definitely worth your attention. Next slide, please. There's also some pending legislation that we wanted to make you aware of, as it would increase the accountability of what is in this plan, the learning continuity plan, if it's passed. The first piece of legislation is Senate Bill 820, which is passed through the Assembly and Senate and is on its way to the governor. And within this legislation are a few important changes. First, the template and instructions for the budget overview for parents will be updated to reflect alignment with the learning continuity and attendance plan. And we expect to see that change has to be made, the modification has to be made by September 15th. So within a couple of weeks, and the template instructions will be modified. And references to the LCAP will be replaced with references to the learning continuity and attendance plan. In addition, there will be a requirement to specify the amount of federal funds allocated to the LEA under the Federal CARES Act. And it replaces existing language in the budget overview with the phrase total budgeted expenditures and total budgeted expenditures that contribute to increased or improved services for unduplicated pupils in the learning continuity and attendance plan. So whereas before you would have had your budget for the year, identifying how you're meeting proportionality with those funds specified with S&C for the LCAP, now you're going to have to note how much within the learning continuity plan is specified for increased or improved services. Next slide, please. In addition, Senate Bill 820 would modify the annual update for the 21-22 LCAP, which you'll be working on in the spring. It changes it in the following ways. The annual update to the LCAP would include the actions and expenditures included in the learning continuity and attendance plan and the local control and accountability plan that was adopted in the 1920 school year. So both the learning continuity plan and the LCAP from last year, those actions would be reflected in the annual update. So there's some additional accountability in that regard. And this requires an update to the template by January 31st, 2021. So we'll be looking to see if this bill passes in January, how that will be modified, the annual update. Next slide, please. SB 820 also has some changes to the learning loss mitigation funds. It extends the time frame for both the expenditure and the reporting of unexpended funds for the GEAR fund. That is federal funding, and it extends it till September 30th, 2022. Some additional time to spend that funding. In addition, it extends the use of the general funds that are included in the Learning Loss Mitigation Trust Fund to June 30th of 2021. So by the end of next spring. One additional adaptation, if this passes, would be that the learning loss mitigation funds could be used to support students in childcare, preschool, and adult education programs. And it does add to the list of allowable expenses any COVID-19 testing, PPE, sanitation supplies, and other related needs. So it would be an expansion of the allowable uses or the use of funds, which should be pretty helpful. And it revises the federal funds reporting timeframe of the unexpended funds that are included in the LLMF of the coronavirus relief funds. However, it would require a revision of federal law to extend the deadline. That's the December 30th, 2020 deadline. So nothing can change there unless it changes on the federal level. So that is the biggest chunk of money. So look forward to any notification of that moving forward. Next slide, please. An additional education measure that passed the legislative process and now heads to the governor is Bill AB 1835. And if AB 1835 is passed, this would actually require each LEA to track the estimated and actual supplemental and concentration grant funds, so the S&C funds, and would require any unspent funds from any given year to be directed towards services for unduplicated pupils in future years. So it wouldn't roll back over into the general fund. You'd be obligated. So it adds a degree of accountability. So this would go into effect, if passed, it would go into effect on January 2021. So thus, any actions stated in the learning continuity plan that are identified as contributing to increased or improved services could be subject to tracking under this law. So just be aware of that. Those are some additional accountability features, and it adds to the why and the seriousness of how you write this and the degree of detail that you put in. So now I'm going to introduce my colleague Rachel, and she's going to start off a little bit deeper dive into the plan itself and hopefully demystify it somewhat.
Evan, before you go, could you just clarify where these bills are in the process? I think there's some confusion there.
So the bills move forward into what's called engrossing and enrolling. So that means they're being proofread. They pass through the Assembly and the Senate, and they get cleaned up. The language gets cleaned up, and they get sent to the governor. And if the governor signs them, then they become law. So they're not law yet. They're pending the governor's approval.
Thanks, Evan.
Thank you, Evan. Good morning, everyone. So it's important to keep in mind the purpose of the Learning Continuity Plan. It's a plan for all students in response to COVID-19. In addition, you have the LCFF requirement to increase or improve services for unduplicated pupils. So it's almost like two plans merged. And the graphic on this slide helps to frame our thinking around this idea. In the Learning Continuity Plan, pages 1 through 5 of the template describe your COVID response for all students, as well as your actions that are contributing to the increased or improved services requirement for unduplicated pupils in response to COVID. What's for all students outside of COVID is really our base program. So in the LCAP, districts choose how much of that to include as it addresses the 8 state priorities. But in the Learning Continuity Plan, that's not required. The increased and improved services requirement is kind of twofold. So in the Learning Continuity Plan, you're indicating and describing how you're increasing and improving services for unduplicated pupils in response to COVID in both pages 1 through 5 and page 6 of the template. Outside of COVID, LEAs are asked to describe how they are increasing or improving services for unduplicated pupils on page 6 of the template. So this would include any actions that the LEAs are implementing outside of the Learning Continuity Plan that are contributing to the increased or improved services requirement. Next slide, please. So this graphic shows another way of looking at this. So here you can see that pages 1 through 5 of the template describe the LEA's COVID response for all students and increased or improved services for unduplicated pupils. Page 6 of the template addresses how the LEA is meeting the increased or improved services requirement, both in response to COVID as well as outside of COVID. And now I will turn it over to Adrienne.
Good morning, everyone. So this next section, we're going to take a look specifically at each section of your learning continuity plan. And we just have some general feedback based on the some of the drafts that we've been able to see and give feedback. So in looking at your learning continuity plan, here are some considerations that you can take a look at. So in terms of the prompts, just an overall general description of what we see is in your descriptions, you need to make sure that they clearly respond to all the components in the prompt as well as the instructions. Remember that the instructions really is where all of the detail is spelled out, and the prompt is really meant in this to allow the reader to just understand what is being talked about. So they go hand in hand, the prompt and the template as well as the instructions. Also, make sure that your prompt is clear and succinct. You know, they caution, CDE cautions about, because you have many parents reading this, that you don't want to have a lot of words that perhaps the outside public may not understand, and also acronyms as well to make sure that those are spelled out. And lastly, to keep in mind when you're addressing the prompts, that your descriptions are comprehensible for all your stakeholders, not just for teachers, but for anyone that was going online and reading your plan. So again, having all those pieces are a good lens to look at in terms of addressing the prompt itself. Next, in looking at the related actions, if you have, when you have the related actions included in your plan, you need to make sure, as Rachel showed in your diagram, is that they address the needs for all students, including students with disabilities, in response to COVID-19. And secondly, when you have actions that are identified as a contributing action, remember they must meet the requirement of being an increased or improved service for your English learners, low-income students, and foster youth. And so you might ask yourself, do the contributing actions clearly identify what will occur, for whom, which students, student groups, and what service is actually being increased in quantity or quality as compared to services provided for all students in addressing the unique needs for your English learners, your low income and foster youth in response to the COVID-19. And lastly, when you look at the funding, make sure that the funding amounts are included with these related items. So let's start with looking at the general information and the stakeholder engagement section of your learning continuity plan. So starting with the general information, here some feedback that we received is, or that we gave, was how has the LEA been impacted by the school closure and the COVID-19 pandemic? And how has it impacted the community? Have you included this in your description? And most importantly, is there a statement included that shares how this understanding of the impact informed the development of your learning continuity and attendance plan? In the stakeholder engagement section, these questions allow you to see some common components that were not addressed in the response, such as, how did the LEA notify members of the public to submit the written comments regarding specific actions and expenditures proposed in your learning plan? And when and how did it occur? Also, how was the information about this process communicated to those with and without internet access, and for those whose primary language is not English? So is this included in your stakeholder engagement section? Also, how were students consulted in the development of your plan? How was stakeholder engagement feedback considered before finalizing your learning continuity plan? And lastly, is there a statement in there describing how the superintendent met with the PAC and the DLAC at separate meetings, and how the superintendent provided each committee with written feedback? So these are some things to make sure that you have included in these two sections of your general information and stakeholder engagement. And now I will turn it over to Amy.
Thank you, Adrienne. So we're going to now move on to the in-person instructional offerings section of our plan. And while the county health orders don't currently allow LA County schools to return to an in-person format, What we noticed is many LEAs are planning for some form of in-person instruction, such as something described as a blended or hybrid model when in-person, a return to in-person becomes possible. So in this section, we have provided some feedback that this is where you would want to describe those plans to stakeholders. The prompt requires a description of the actions the LEA will take to offer classroom-based instruction wherever possible, particularly for students who have experienced significant learning loss. Another component in the instructions requires districts to use data and assessments to identify learning loss. And so while plans address the cycle of assessments, many plans we're seeing will talk about how they have common assessments or they're offering formative, summative assessments. The response should also address how that data will be used to address student needs. And then finally, another common area of feedback has been that we are seeing plans where all the actions listed in the plan are marked as contributing. And so as we saw earlier in Rachel's organization slides, we would also expect to see some actions that are for all students and not necessarily all actions marked as contributing. The action descriptions, sometimes when you're reading them, might seem that they are not contributing, and those would be ones that would appear to be benefiting all students and not designed to meet the unique needs of our unduplicated students, which are English learners, foster youth, and low-income students. Also, when the description identifies other targeted groups outside of unduplicated pupils as defined in Ed Code, those actions would no longer be identified as targeted contributing actions. For example, if the action is saying that it would be targeting English learners, foster youth, and students with disabilities, then we know that students with exceptional needs or students with disabilities is not one of our targeted groups. If actions are, though, being provided on a wide basis, that is LEA-wide or school-wide, that action would need to then be designed in a manner that considered the needs of unduplicated pupils first, and the plan would then describe how the action was principally directed and effective, and that would be supported with the additional required descriptions. These comments about contributing actions and how those are designed and included in the plan is really a general comment that we see across all areas of the plan. So we won't be repeating that, but we do want to make note that that would be something that applies to all areas and sections of the Learning Continuity Plan. Next slide, please. So for the distance learning section, as you know, this section has 6 separate prompts. This is a slide that provides a number of common areas that we've seen, that we've been providing feedback on plans that we've read so far. This is a section where you're describing the platforms, tools, resources, curriculum, and/or services that are in use within the distance learning programs at your sites. And those are probably being used to access the full curriculum and provide instructional continuity. The responses could be strengthened by providing clarity to the reader when you can to identify what those programs are and provide a description of those that are most central to your programming. We have also provided feedback asking LEAs to describe how they ascertain the needs of students in relation to distance learning. That's one of the prompts that is contained within the instructions. Usually we'll see in other parts of the plan that the LEAs conducted a reopening survey or distance learning readiness survey, or in some way they have engaged stakeholders in the process of planning for the new school year. So it might be also a good place to include that those were how you determine the needs, and therefore these are the actions we took to meet those needs. Another area in this section we've asked LEAs to expand upon is in relation to time value of pupil work. So the template instructions ask LEAs to provide specific information about how the LEA will track and monitor student progress through live contacts and synchronous instructional minutes, and a description of how the LEA will measure participation and time value of student work. So if teachers are the ones responsible for assigning time value, what does that look like? And did the LEA provide training or guidelines in that regard? Next, we'll talk about modified staff roles. So we have provided some feedback to LEAs, asking them to provide further description around the changes to roles for those roles that are not feasible in a remote environment, and to also include modifications made to address both academic and social emotional needs. And lastly, in this section, for the prompt addressing unique needs, we have provided feedback asking how the needs are being addressed for each student group and looking at ways in which strategies might differ for each student group versus a statement that provides the same intervention or strategy for all the groups. So next, you'll hear from Jeannie, who will go into pupil learning loss.
Thanks, Amy, and good morning, everyone. So for pupil learning loss, based on the initial reviews of district drafts for the continuity plan, the following questions and comments have been shared in response to common areas that emerged for follow-up addressing pupil learning loss. In some of the responses, they have not included the 3 content areas required to be addressed in the prompt about learning loss. So we have asked if LEAs can include information about the tools and at what frequency the district will assess student learning status in English language arts, English language development, and mathematics. And in some cases, the responses addressed English language arts and mathematics, but did not address English language development. So we've asked for information specific to that content area. In some cases, information has not been included about specific strategies and how they differ for each of the groups to address learning loss and accelerate learning for English learners, low income, foster youth, pupils experiencing homelessness, and pupils with exceptional needs. So we've noted that in our feedback that the response does not address the specific strategies and what's different among those strategies. Additionally, in this section, the LEA needs to address the effectiveness of services in each of the 3 content areas, and in some cases, we've asked for how the effectiveness of services will be determined specifically in English language development. And as a suggestion, we've also included a suggestion where stakeholders could benefit from knowing how the instructional model will support students to make up for key concepts they may have missed out on last spring, and or to provide opportunities where they need more practice and at the same time address current grade level standards in ELA, math, and continue to develop language proficiency. Next slide, please. Some common areas we have noted for follow-up in the mental health and social emotional well-being section are included here. And here we've provided questions about the resources the LEA will provide to staff and pupils to address trauma and other impacts of the pandemic on the school community. And we've asked about the professional development the LEA will provide to staff, as well as how the LEA will monitor and support mental health and social emotional well-being of both pupils and staff during the school year. And these questions have applied to the description provided for the prompt, as well as the related actions that maybe have been included or not included for this section in the drafts that we've reviewed. In the section addressing pupil and family engagement and outreach, we've asked about the procedures the district will follow to support tiered re-engagement after students are identified for not attending with the distance learning requirements. And here, it's important to note that the instructions address the requirements in Ed Code 43504 F2 requiring LEAs to develop written procedures for tiered re-engagement strategies for all pupils who are absent from distance learning for more than 3 days or 60% of the instructional days in a week. And per statute, these procedures shall include verification of current contact information for enrolled pupils, daily notification to the parent or guardian of the student related to the absences, a plan for outreach from the school to determine pupil needs, including connection with health and social services as necessary, and when feasible, transitioning the pupil from to full-time in-person instruction. And so these questions have applied to the description provided in the Pupil and Family Engagement and Outreach section, as well as the related actions included or not included in this section. Next slide, please. To frame the thinking around the next section addressing increased or improved services, we developed a visual to focus on what increased and improved services are and how a planning process supports designing these services. So planning with forethought continues to be foundational in determining what an LEA will do and how they will meet their obligation to increase or improve services in response to the needs of their English learners, low income, and foster youth. This graphic displays a process to first identify and understand the needs, conditions, and circumstances of each of the unduplicated pupils, and then using those considerations to reflect on how they might inform the design, content, location, or methods within an action that will be responsive to the needs and barriers facing the unduplicated pupil group. Using this understanding of the need of each unduplicated student group to inform the design of the action positions the LEA to best determine what they will do for whom to address the unique needs of unduplicated student groups in response to COVID-19. With this foundation in place, the LEA can best determine what actions they will provide to support the intended student groups and where actions would be targeted only for a particular unduplicated pupil group or principally directed and effective for unduplicated pupils when provided school-wide or district-wide. Identifying and understanding the needs of the UDP groups informs the design of actions that increase or improve services in response to those needs. When the actions identified as contributing to meeting the requirement to increase or improve services for unduplicated pupils have been designed with forethought, the description in the final section about how the LEA is increasing or improving services should reflect the action planning process and come easily. Next slide, please. So per statute, the Learning Continuity Plan shall describe how the LEA will increase or improve services in proportion to funding they receive based on the number and concentration of EL, low income, and foster youth, and pursuant to the spending regulations that address the use of funding for these students. This screenshot of the template for increased or improved services is similar to the section in the LCAP template where the LEA identifies the percentage to increase or improve services, which continues to reflect the amount of the increased apportionment the LEA receives based on the number and concentration of their low-income EL and foster youth enrollment, and the corresponding percentage reflecting the proportional increase in funding compared to funding the LEA receives for all students. Our feedback has provided districts with contacts in business advisory services at the LA County Office of Ed to confirm the amount and percentage included in the learning continuity plans aligns with the apportionment reflected in the LEA's budget and the apportionment reflected in the RAD system or in alignment with the FICMAC calculator. In this section, 2 prompts require descriptions that address specific components included in the Title V regulations outlining the LCFF spending requirements for increased services, for the increased supplemental and concentration grant apportionment. The first prompt requires explanations for LEA-wide and school-wide actions included within the learning continuity plan that are marked as contributing to meeting the increased or improved services requirement. The second prompt requires a description of how services are increased or improved by the services within the learning continuity plan and by any additional services that are included outside of the learning continuity plan. So let's take a look at the next slide. And here we see that the slide embeds the template instructions under the prompt. And this is included for your reference. With this information, we see that for the first prompt, the description that the LEA provides must address the LEA-wide and or school-wide actions included in their learning continuity plan that are contributing to the increased or improved services requirement. The instructions for the prompt reference the spending regulations for the proportional increase in funding, which requires LEAs to explain how actions being provided to an entire school or across an entire school district are principally directed to and effective in meeting the needs for the intended unduplicated student groups. For these actions, the LEA needs to explain how the LEA considered the needs, conditions, and circumstances of the unduplicated pupil group as a result of COVID-19, how the action or actions or aspects of the actions, including, for example, its design, content, or methods or location, is based on these considerations, and how the action is intended to meet the needs of the unduplicated students in response to COVID-19. The second response requires a description of how services for foster youth, English learners, and low income are being increased or improved by the percentage calculated as compared to services provided for all students. The instructions here include that to improve services means to grow services in quality, and to increase services means to grow services in quantity. The instructions also state here that the description for this section applies to the services marked in the learning continuity plan as contributing, as well as applies to any additional actions or services outside of the plan that contribute toward meeting the increased or improved services requirement. Next slide, please. So based on our initial review, our feedback has addressed some confusion about what to include in the response for prompt 1 and how the response might be organized. We've included feedback indicating that for the instructions, the response needs to provide a general explanation for school-wide and LEA-wide actions that are included in the learning continuity plan. And these descriptions need to explain how they are principally directed and effective. So to do that for these actions, the response needs to explain those 3 components included in the instructions: how the LEA considered the needs and designed their school-wide and district-wide actions to address these needs, and how these needs are intended to meet the specific needs of unduplicated pupils in response to COVID-19. We've also included a suggestion that once the LEA has determined all of the actions to address the sections in the plan, they might consider organizing their response using the plan categories. So it would be clear how school-wide and district-wide actions are principally directed and effective for each unduplicated pupils in what the LEA is planning in in-person instructional offerings, in the distance learning model, through what the LEA is planning in pupil learning loss, and so forth. So using that frame of the sections may support LEAs in providing these descriptions. Next slide, please. For prompt 2, we've again addressed some confusion about what to include in the response and how the response might be organized. And here we've provided feedback indicating that the prompt focuses on how the LEA is increasing the quantity of services and or improving the quality of services for each of the unduplicated pupil groups through all actions marked as contributing in the learning continuity plan and any additional actions that the LEA will provide. Keep in mind, this prompt is asking the LEA to provide a comprehensive description in a single section, explaining how they will increase or improve services for unduplicated students as compared to what they will provide for all students. And this section may be organized using the plan categories, and we've provided that as a suggestion. You may also consider addressing each of the unduplicated pupil groups separately and describing how you're increasing or improving services for each of the groups. And now I'm going to turn it over to Amy, and she's going to talk about the pre-review process.
Yes, thank you, Jeannie. So a lot of the examples of feedback we've been providing come from some of the pre-reviews that we've already started doing. But for those of you who have not yet had a chance to submit and we're planning to do so, we are asking for 80 Los Angeles school districts, we are asking to allow for a 1-week turnaround. If you do have a specific need for an expedited review, just reach out to your coordinator and we can see what we can do depending on the volume of plans we're reviewing at the time. And hopefully you're familiar with who your assigned coordinator is for your school district, but if not, it's probably the person who most recently emailed you about the written report to the community, or if you're still unsure, you can always email lcap@laco.edu and ask to be put in touch with your district's assigned LCAP coordinator. We have begun to conduct those pre-reviews, and some of the comment areas of feedback were provided in those earlier slides. And so just to summarize, the comments or informal feedback were providing right now is focused on areas that could be expanded upon based on the Learning Continuity Plan instructions and what constitutes a sufficient response, and or areas that need to address the requirements contained in SB 98 Ed Code 43509. We are also providing comments that we feel might be areas that would be of further interest to your stakeholders, often posed in the form of a question, just for the clarity of that. And we are also considering an equity lens through which is what we see when stakeholders and advocacy groups are reviewing plans. So we're taking a look, especially in regards to that increased and improved services section. Next slide, please. We also want to remind everyone about our process and submission checklist for the Learning Continuity Plan, which is available as one of the resources on our LCAP webpage. So the link's been included there on that slide. The tool was intended to help LEAs backwards plan as they approach the September 30th adoption deadline. Each of your LEAs is likely by now to have scheduled your public hearing and adoption dates with your local governing board or body meetings. And once your plan is adopted, you will submit your plan through the LACOE LCAP system to the county office within 5 days. So as a point of clarification, if your board meeting, for example, to adopt the plan is on September 15th, then you would submit your plan to LACOE by September 20th, which is the 5th calendar day after September 15th. If your board approval date is September 30th, for example, which would be the last date of the deadline, then you would be submitting your plan to LACOE by October 5th. So it would be 5 days after. Next slide, please. This slide shows a screenshot of our LACOE LCAP system. And just as LEAs recently submitted their written reports to the community through this system, we will again be using the same system for submission of the learning continuity plans. After logging into the system, you'll see a tab for the learning continuity plan on the left sidebar. And again, this submission system is for LA County LEAs, and that would be both school districts and charter schools. So both school districts and charter schools are required to submit their adopted plan to the county office. Next slide. So what happens after the submission of your board adopted plan? To review what happens after submission for school districts, following that submission of your plan to LACOE, we will provide recommendations for consideration by October 30th. The district will then have 15 days to consider those recommendations in a public meeting of the governing board within 15 days. Some of you have expressed earlier had expressed concern over this timeline due to your board schedule. So please work with your coordinator. We can try to coordinate the date you receive your recommendations so that you'll be able to take them to a scheduled board meeting within the 15-day window. There is no option for a clarification prior to sending the recommendation. We will be providing the recommendations based on the plan submitted to us in the LACOE LCAP system. As a reminder, the County Office of Education is not approving or disapproving your learning continuity plan. SB 98 did not give the county office that authority to approve or disapprove plans in the same manner that they do with the LCAP. The CDE has provided some guidelines for possible reasons a county office might provide recommendations for consideration, and that's what they're calling it, is the recommendations for consideration. And some of those possible reasons that CDE provided were that if you left certain sections of the plan blank or incomplete. Number two, if the response did not fully address the prompt or that they didn't meet the requirements contained within the instructions or key elements as described in SB 98. Number three, the descriptions will not be comprehensible to stakeholders. Or number four, the plan does not clearly describe how an LEA plans to increase or improve services for its unduplicated students as compared to all students. So that concludes our presentation on the Learning Continuity Plan. And I know that we might have some people in attendance on this Zoom who came specifically to hear this portion of our presentation. You did see the agenda, and we will next be providing some information about the Learning Loss Mitigation Funds, which does also have some connections to the Learning Continuity Plan. So you're welcome to stay on, of course. We invite any and all guests to remain with us. And I will go ahead and turn it over next to Adrian to talk about the learning loss mitigation funds. Thank you.
Hello again. So let's take a look at the learning loss mitigation funds. So these funds and the distribution formula are outlined in the 2021 budget package. And these funds are meant to support pupil academic achievement and to mitigate learning loss related to COVID-19 school closures. So here are the 4 main reasons and the intended purpose of how these funds are to be used. Number 1 is to address any learning loss, or can be through the implementation, expansion, or enhancement of learning supports that begin before the start of the school year, and the continuation of intensive instruction and supports into the school year. A second use could be to extend the instructional school year by making adjustments to the academic calendar that would either increase the amount of instructional time or service provided to the students based on their learning needs. A third use could be to provide additional academic services for pupils, such as diagnostic assessments, intensive instruction for addressing the gaps in core academic skills, or additional instructional materials or supports or devices and connectivity for the provision of in-classroom and distance learning. And lastly, the funds can be used to provide integrated pupil support to address other barriers to learning, such as health, counseling, or mental health services, professional development opportunities to help teachers and parents in distance learning contexts, access to school breakfast and lunch programs, and programs to address pupil trauma and social emotional learning. So those are the many uses that your learning loss mitigation funds can be used for. So a common question that we get is, so how does this learning loss mitigation funds connect to the learning continuity plan? So we see in Ed Code 43509F2, we see that it requires you to describe how federal and state funding are included and used to support the efforts that are described in your learning continuity and attendance plan. And this would include federal and state funds provided for the learning loss mitigation pursuant to Section 110 of this Act, adding to this part. So we have received the question about whether you have to include all of the learning loss mitigation funds in the plan. So we wanted to address that right now. And so although there is no requirement for the inclusion of any particular funding source in the plan, with the exception, these 2 exceptions, in terms of federal funds, these are included to the extent that they are being used for any COVID-related response categories called out in legislation. And so we know that the learning loss mitigation funds are specifically called out in litigation. So that necessitates the LLMF funds to be included in your plan. And in regards to state funding, these are included in the extent that they are being used for any COVID-related response categories called out in legislation as well. So this would include the LCFF, if any LEAs have identified the amount of their, and so then with the, this plan, there is that section where you will have to identify your supplemental and concentration dollar amount as well as the percentage. So that also is needs to be included in your learning continuity plan. So in summary, to answer this specific question, our guidance is that an LEA must describe how it is using the funding to support the actions that are articulated in your learning continuity plan. So in looking at the allowable uses that I just went over in the previous slide, you know what they are, and since these are this is the focus of your learning continuity plan, it is reasonable to expect that all or most of the funds will be used to pay for these actions. And so it is recommended to include most of the funds in the plan, because if not, you can anticipate questions from your stakeholders wondering why, and why isn't all the money used to address the needs of distance learning and the COVID-19. And last, here's the learning loss mitigation funds. Here's a useful chart of all the different funds under the LLMF grant that has been posted on CDE's website. And this is as of the August 31st. You can see the 3 funds. You can see the amounts and the timeline of use as well, and the resource code. And you can note at the bottom that, as Evan mentioned earlier, SB 820, if passed, would extend the general fund through June 30th of 2021, and SB 820 would also include the provision to extend the use of the Corona Relief Funds pending federal approval. So this is kind of a nice visual to kind of see how all of these play into the learning loss mitigation funds. So now I will turn it over to, who am I turning it over to?
You're turning it over to me. This is Bonnie.
Ah, wonderful, Bonnie. Fiscal accountability.
All right. So now we're going to take a look at some of the fiscal accountability requirements for CARES funds. And let's take a look. The next slide we're going to share is from a recent news report about misuse of CARES funds. So we share this with you to show why there are oversight requirements, and also that these are the kinds of things that will inform the kind of oversight and the sort of audit responses. So just to know that there are processes in place for oversight, but there's already been reports of misuse of these funds. And so let's take a look at some of the requirements and oversight processes that are in place. First of all, just to clarify, these funds are, because we've been using these terms, the GEAR funds are the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Funds, and these are the funds that are included in your learning loss mitigation funding. The others are that we'll talk about are ESSER funds, which are the Elementary and Secondary Emergency Relief Funds, and these are the funds that were allocated separately based on your Title I allocation amounts, and that application came out the end of June. So those are the 2 funds we're talking about in the first section. So all CARES funds are subject to federal requirements and oversight, and they're slightly different for various funding sources, and that's because they come from different sections of the law. The terms and conditions for the ESSER and GEAR funds include the uniform guidance requirements. So they're subject to all the uniform guidance requirements. And that's because these are allocated under the education programs. So some of these are things that you're going to be very familiar with if you've been working with federal programs. For example, internal controls. There's an expectation that you have policies and procedures, and your ESSER and GEAR funds are subject to those internal policies and procedures to ensure that they are used appropriately to meet the program objectives, and they're not subject to misuse. The second, adherence to the federal cost principles, and we're all familiar with reasonable, necessary, and allocable. However, one to keep in mind also is that federal funds have to be treated consistently with state and local funds. So you have to, whatever spending policies you have to apply them equally to both of those federal and state funds. Time and effort reporting requirements are included in the Uniform Grants Guidance, and those are applicable to GEAR and ESSER funds, and we'll talk about those a bit later. Things like equipment management, and then also other policies and procedures for procurement, conflict of interest. All of those requirements apply to those 2 funding sources. The ESSER and GEAR funds are also subject to the Single Audit Act. And that means those funds will be audited with your single audit if you're eligible for receiving a single audit. And we'll take a look at that also in a minute. Now, one other group of funds that are included in learning loss mitigation are the Coronavirus Relief Funds. You see those referenced as CR. And those funds are also subject to the Code of Federal Regulations, the Uniform Grants Guidance, but only specific sections of it. So one section there includes internal controls. So again, you're expected to have control measures in place and follow those for those funds. Also, they're subject to the audit requirements. So the CR funds would also be included in your single audit. And then finally, let me back up. Sub-recipient monitoring and management. What that means is the CDE has the authority to monitor these funds. So that means CDE can review or include them in any review or monitoring process moving forward. Specifically, time and effort section is not applicable to coronavirus relief funds. However, CDE has strongly recommended that any funds used for this purpose, that you do maintain some sort of time and effort reporting, because you will have to report on those funds. Finally, U.S. Department of Education has recommended that for all CARES funds that LEAs maintain contemporaneous planning documentation. And so for your learning loss, for your learning continuity plan, this is exactly the kind of place that this can be documented. How are you planning for the use of these funds? Let's take a look at the next page on audits. So just a couple words about audits. We mentioned that these funds are all subject to the single audit requirement, and that means that those funds are also included in determining the threshold for audits. LEAs receiving over $750,000 in total in federal funds are subject to the Single Audit Act, and that requires annual audits of your federal funds. If you receive under $750,000, keep in mind that the additional funds through ESSER, GEAR, and the coronavirus relief funds are included in determining that threshold, and that could put you over the threshold, which would put you under the requirement for the single audit. Right. The other thing, the scope and focus of the audit is defined in the compliance supplement. So annually, the compliance supplement is updated, and the compliance supplement is the document that auditors use for auditing federal programs. The 2021 supplement will include the requirements for audits of the ESSER, GEAR, and coronavirus relief funds. Okay, so we also mentioned time and effort reporting. LEAs receiving federal funds have to have policies and procedures in place for time and effort reporting for any employee paid in whole or in part with federal funds. They have to follow, in addition to having those in place, LEAs have to follow their own policies and procedures for time and effort reporting. And as we mentioned, ESSER and GEAR funds are governed by the Uniform Grants Guidance, so time and effort reporting is required. But if the current situation under COVID has changed how your time and effort reporting is taking place, or how employees how that oversight is taking place, LEAs have been encouraged to look at their current policies and procedures and see if you have procedures in place for reporting under extraordinary circumstances, and then look to see if those current procedures match what you're currently doing and match your current needs. And if they don't include that section, then LEAs are encouraged to update their policies so you address how you're reporting under COVID conditions. And the link at the top takes you to the CDE website, where they give you some guidance on developing time and effort reporting, what the requirements are under COVID specifically, and also some links to federal guidance on this issue. This would also include looking at how you're going to report for your ESSER, GEAR, and coronavirus relief funds. Keep in mind those funds aren't subject to the federal supplement not supplant requirements, but they are subject to time and effort reporting. So you might want to look at how you're reporting. For example, if you paid for any services prior to, you could pay that prior to from, I believe it was March, that you could start paying back. Well, how are you collecting time and effort for anyone that was paid for those services? So just take a look and make sure that whatever you have in your policies reflects what you're doing. Okay. All right, let's take a look at the next slide, which has to do with legal assurances, because we've had some questions about this. When you applied for both the ESSER and the learning loss mitigation funds, you were required to agree to legal assurances. They were separate for that. ESSER had its own set of legal assurances you agreed to, and the learning loss mitigation funds had assurances, but as some of you noted, there were a number of different sets of assurances in there. So one would include general assurances for learning loss mitigation funds. These were addressing state requirements for the use of the funds. There was also a set of assurances for GEAR, and those were assurances based on the federal requirements for use of GEAR funds. And there were 3 sections for that. And the general assurances, one on the use of funds, and then some additional assurances. And finally, there were assurances related to the coronavirus relief funds. And the reason for these separate assurances is these all have different federal requirements, and they also have additional state requirements. So the LEAs had to agree to all of those. Let's take a look at what some of those look like and what you agreed to. Okay. So the learning loss mitigation assurances included the 4 identified use of funds. So the LEA, you as an LEA agreed to use the funds for those identified purposes. They also include an agreement that you adopt a learning continuity and attendance plan. So that was part of those assurances. In addition, the LEA agreed to maintaining records of expenditures and complying with state and federal reporting requirements. So that was regarding overall the learning loss mitigation funds. As for GEAR funds, they included 3 sections: a general section, use of funds, and other assurances. And included in the GEAR assurances were some of those listed on this slide. So, for example, control of funds and title to property has to be with the LEA. So that's the same as for other programs, but that was called out. Reasonable opportunities for parents and teachers to be involved in planning. There's a section on limitations on construction costs. There's also assurance about having procedures in place for disseminating promising practices to teachers and research. There's a prohibition on subsidizing executive salaries of non-LEA employees. It also a general assurance of that the LEA will comply with EDGAR, Education Department General Administrative Regulations, the Uniform Guidance, and other federal regulations. And they also called out in there the prohibition on lobbying. So those were the GEAR assurances. It also included a list of the 15 allowable use of GEAR funds under the federal legislation. Because the GEAR allowable use of funds is much more broad, and the learning loss mitigation funds have the 4 identified uses, which are more narrow, the 2 are not in conflict. It actually just, you need to abide by both of them, but they are not in conflict. One is just a broader use, and the learning loss mitigation tightens it to specifically those 4 requirements. All right, next let's take a look at what else you agreed to. Okay, for the coronavirus relief funds, you also addressed the assurances, and you assured that the expenditures would be necessary due to COVID. So that's a general assurance for those coronavirus relief funds. They were allocated by Congress to be used in response to COVID. They were incurred during the period which is there, which is now in legislation and being updated, hopefully. We're hoping for that. They also indicated there are some ineligible activities. So, for example, if something is covered by insurance, you can't use coronavirus relief funds to pay for it, or if it's being reimbursed by another federal program. In other words, you can't duplicate those expenditures. You can't use it to reimburse donors for donated services. You can't use it for hazard pay or you can't use it for bonuses unless they're specifically for hazard pay or overtime. And then severance pay or legal settlements, again, are specified as not allowable use of funds. You agreed to participating in the Single Audit Act and that your funds would be included in that, and that it is subject to internal controls, sub-recipient monitoring, and audit requirements, as we mentioned earlier. So that's what all those the assurances that you agreed to were about, and there for each program you had to agree to them. All right, next. All right, next, the other area that we've had questions about are the equitable services requirement. This has been going on for some time and a lot of questions on it. So we just wanted to address it quickly here. So let's take a look at what the issue is and where we stand on it. Next slide. Okay, so we know that both ESSER and GEAR funds, only those two funds, are subject to equitable services requirement, okay? GEAR funds are included in that learning loss mitigation fund group of funds, but it's only the GEAR funds, not the whole learning loss mitigation amount. So you just pull out the GEAR funds. Both of those are subject to equitable services requirements. So what does the law say? Next slide. The law says that an LEA receiving those funds, 1802 and 1803, refer to the GEAR and ESSER sections of the CARES Act, that they have to provide equitable services. And here's the phrase that's caused the problem. It's in the same manner as provided under Section 1117. Section 1117 refers to Title I, Part A. So this says it should be in the same manner as Title I. But let's take a look at the next slide and see what's happened. On April 30th, U.S. Department of Education issued guidance, and that guidance indicated that the equitable share should be calculated based on the total enrollment of private school students. This caused consternation, shall we say, and CDE include on its website indicated that this guidance was controversial, and they agreed with other states that this was contrary to the law. So the understanding of the department in many states was if it's allocated based on the Title I formula, that should be based on low-income students, not total enrollment. So next, on June 24th, U.S. Department issued something called Interim Final Rule, which is the first step in going toward regulations. And it provided 3 options for calculating the equitable share. And it included both using enrollment or using low-income numbers. However, it put restrictions on the use of funds in public schools if poverty data was used for that determination. Then on July 7th, California joined a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court against Secretary DeVos and ED's, as they said, attempt to divert funds away from public schools. Right? So that's where things stood as of the 1st of July. We have on the next slide a little bit more on that interim rule and what that looks like. So the interim rule said that in LEAs, if they spend funds only on students and teachers in your Title I schools, then you could use a poverty to determine the equitable share. So the LEA's proportional share could be determined based on total enrollment or one of two ways using poverty data. One would be to use your 1920 numbers and move forward, or the others using current numbers of low-income students in your public schools and in your private schools. And this is age 5 through 17 only. And then coming up with an equitable share based on, you add those two together, divide them into the total funding amount, and come up with a per pupil amount, and use that to determine the equitable share. So that was, but the limitation on that is, and let's take a look at the next slide. The conditions that were placed on that in that final rule said that if an LEA decides to use either one of those poverty data procedures, they could only use the ESSER and GEAR funds in their Title I schools, and they had to be careful to ensure they didn't violate supplement, not supplant, by allocating CARES funds to Title I schools and redirecting their state and local funds from those schools to non-Title I schools. So the supplement CARES and the CARES Act funds are not subject to supplement, not supplant requirements, but this guidance put that in there and limited the use. We checked on this, we had questions. It doesn't limit the use to any particular students in either public or private schools. So all students would be eligible. What's in question is the formula for determining that amount. Okay, next slide. So this is just your options using total enrollment. You can use total enrollment, the LEA enrollment, plus the private school enrollment, and determine a per pupil amount based on that. You can use your 1920 Title I share, so whatever you had for 1920, use that to determine your per pupil amount, or you could use the current number of low-income students age 5 through 17 in your Title I schools and in your participating private schools. Put those two together, divide it to the funding amount, come up with a per pupil amount. So those are the three options in the regulations, all right? However, an update, we've had at least one of court case. Many states weighed in with litigation. And on August 21st, we had a decision from a judge in Washington state who issued a preliminary injunction blocking implementation of the guidance we talked about that was initially put out and this final interim rule. And Ed had purported that the statute was ambiguous, so they said they had the authority to impose these rules. And the judge determined that no, the department didn't have explicit authority to develop its own rules under the CARES Act, that it was clear. What we don't know is the degree to which that decision in Washington state is applicable to other states. So we're sort of in a holding pattern on where that is right now. So your question is, what do I do now? So let's take a look at the next slide and what you can do. First of all, make sure you're consulting. We've always encouraged this because you don't want to delay consultation because you could receive a complaint that you're not consulting in a timely manner because you have to have timely consultation. So make sure you're consulting. Make sure you understand clearly what the options are. 3 options, make sure you understand them, and I would say go ahead and look at the numbers and see what the implications are for your district. And then third, CDE has recommended that you consult with your legal counsel on this, and we definitely encourage you to talk to your district leadership regarding these options and don't make this decision alone, okay? So do you want to move forward with one of these, or do you want to begin with those low income numbers and set aside funds in case the cases are determined differently? Avoid delays in beginning services through ongoing consultation. So if you can come to agreement and get services going, that's always the best. Keep in mind, private schools can file a complaint directly to CDE, and if CDE, whatever that decision is, either party then can appeal to the U.S. Department of Education. So that's where it would finally go. And that's why Many of you are in a challenging place right now as to how to make a decision because a lot of things, frankly, aren't known at this point. Okay. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, who's going to take a look at some school planning related issues.
Thank you, Bonnie. In this next section, we're going to provide a few reminders and updates related to school planning. Next slide, please. There have not been any changes to the state or federal legal requirements for school plans. So SIPSAs are still required for Title I school-wide programs and schools identified for comprehensive support and improvement, targeted support and improvement, and additional targeted support and improvement. Per Education Code 64001, the school plan must be reviewed and annually updated by the school site council, including proposed expenditures. The plan must also be reviewed and approved by the local governing board or body of the LEA at a regularly scheduled meeting whenever there are material changes. And since there's not a required timeline or date by which the school plan needs to be developed or approved, this is a local decision. And we know that a number of LEAs adjusted their SIPSA development and approval timelines from the spring to the fall for their 2020-21 school plans due to the school closures. So it's important to note that the SIPSA requirements are still in place and you must have an approved plan to expend funds. I'd also like to note that Executive Orders N2920 and N5620 provide guidance regarding holding public meetings telephonically or virtually. As a result of these executive orders, schools are able to meet with their school site councils and ELACs virtually. So if schools do not yet have a 2020-21 SIPSA in place, they can meet with their school site councils virtually to develop and update their school plans. Next slide, please. Education Code 64001J allows charter schools and single school districts to use the LCAP as its school plan, provided it meets federal school planning and stakeholder requirements. However, this is not an option for the 2020-21 school year since there is not an LCAP this year, and the Learning Continuity Plan may not serve as the SIPSA. So for the 2020-21 school year, charter schools operating a Title I school-wide program or identified as CSI, TSI, or ATSI will need to complete a SIPSA. It's also important to note that if signed, Senate Bill 820 would require charter schools and single school districts to use the stakeholder engagement process for the Learning Continuity Plan to meet the stakeholder engagement requirements for the adoption of their 2020-21 SIPSA. This would mean that charter schools would not be required to establish a school site council for the development and approval of their SIPSA. Next slide, please. The proposed CSI prompt process is just something that we wanted to put on your radar. In prior years, the LCAP was the mechanism by which the State Board of Education approved the CSI prompts. Since there is no LCAP this year, the CDE is working with the State Board on a process and timeline for approval of the CSI prompts for the 2020-21 school year. The current proposal by CDE is to move the timeline of CSI prompt approvals by the State Board from January 2021 to the spring of 2021. This would mean that LEAs would submit CSI prompts to the County Office of Education in early 2021, and county offices would approve the CSI prompts and report to the CDE by February or March of 2021. CDE has also indicated that the prompts would be the same as those in the LCAP, and that they would create a fillable form that would be posted on the CDE website. Next slide, please. So this slide lists the 3 CSI prompts from the current LCAP template, and you can see there is a screenshot of the prompts from the template at the bottom of the slide. So based on the current CDE proposal, these would be the prompts that LEAs would need to address. And so the first prompt asks LEAs to identify the schools that are eligible for CSI. The second prompt asks LEAs to describe how the LEA has or will support its eligible schools in developing comprehensive support and improvement plans. And the third prompt asks LEAs to describe how they will monitor and evaluate the plan to support student and school improvement. Again, this is just the current proposal, so it is still subject to change. But we just wanted to put it on your radar so that you can begin thinking about and documenting how you're supporting the CSI schools. And we will keep you updated as we receive additional information regarding the CSI prompt process. Next slide, please. We've also received some questions about whether or not there would be additional CSI funds, and the answer is yes. For fiscal year 2020 CSI funds, the CDE anticipates releasing the application for funding in early January 2021. Eligibility would be based on schools that were identified for CSI based on the 2019 dashboard. And these funds must be used to develop and implement CSI plans in the 2021-22 school year. Next slide, please. During this summer, we provided 8 virtual PD modules on a number of topics, such as district and site level planning, parent and family engagement, fiscal management, and equitable services. If you weren't able to participate and would like additional information, all of the presentation slides, Q&A follow-up documents, and recordings are posted on the LACOE State and Federal Programs webpage, and the link has been included on this slide. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier in this presentation, Senate Bill 820 proposes changes to the budget overview for parents, and CDE is hosting a Tuesday at 2 webinar this Tuesday, September 8th, to gather input related to the budget overview for parents template and instructions for the 2020-21 school year. And the Zoom link and passcode to this webinar is included on the slide. Next slide, please. Our next meeting is scheduled for September 24th, and this slide highlights some of the topics that we will be addressing at this meeting. Next slide, please. So if you have any additional questions, please put them in the chat and we will respond in our Q&A follow-up document. So we'll send that out to everyone as well as post it on our site. And the next slide is our contact information. So if you have any additional questions, you can contact any of us as well. And so again, thank you all for joining us. That concludes our presentation. And again, we will keep the chat open for a few minutes in case there are any additional questions that you would like to include.